Chapter 10. Fire versus Earth. For half a second, Tucker considered throwing flames at his opponent to put him off guard, or trying to catch him in the center of his firewall technique. He had to remind himself that he was in an enclosed space where attacks like that would cause considerable collateral damage. Instead, Tucker settled on something more traditional. Sliding up to his opponent, he launched a series of rapid punches with his fiery fists, which Rocky managed to deflect one after another with a flurry of whirlwind hand motions that bypassed Tucker's fists and struck at his arms, throwing them wide, making a clear opening in Tucker's guard. Not one to waste an opportunity, Rocky took advantage of that opening with a palm thrust to Tucker's chest that Tucker barely felt thanks to his aura, though the force of the blow did knock him back. His arms flailed forward as he stumbled, and Rocky grabbed him by his right arm and turned in place. Tucker could feel his opponent's energies mixing, staying mixed this time, and a rust-colored aura sprang into existence around Rocky, just long enough for him to throw Tucker toward the edge of the mat. Tucker smiled as he sailed out of control through the air. He wondered if his opponent thought that he'd already won, even as he sent his aura out ahead of himself. His forward momentum stopped immediately. He threw his weight, righting himself, and he dropped to his feet only inches from the boundary, smirking at his opponent triumphantly. Without hesitation, Tucker redoubled his efforts, attacking so quickly as he darted around his opponent that he seemed to be attacking from more than one place at a time. Rocky, however, was able to follow Tucker without too much trouble, making simple movements, keeping ahead of Tucker and deflecting each of his attacks in turn, never once surrendering his original position. Tucker, being one who enjoys a challenge, decided that he had to at least make Rocky move. It became a matter of pride for him very quickly. Taking a page out of Joe's book, he changed his direction so abruptly that he left behind a latent image in his opponent's eye. While Rocky was busy moving to intercept something that wasn't even there, Tucker zipped around behind him and punched him in the back. Rocky stumbled forward, his stance finally breaking, and Tucker pressed his advantage. He launched himself forward, but as he did, Rocky turned on his heel, moving much more quickly and nimbly than Tucker would have guessed that he could from his build, and he sent his soul out into the air past his hand. A circular barrier about the diameter of a beach ball appeared there, absorbing the full force of Tucker's latest strike. Then the barrier turned the kinetic energy of Tucker's attack back on him and knocked him away. Tucker managed to catch and steady himself, and renewed his attack immediately, firing off punches even faster than before. Rocky created a second barrier with his other hand. Their movements followed his hands, deflecting and reflecting each hit in turn, causing Tucker greater and greater damage until, finally, Tucker drew back for one final strike, putting everything he had into it. Rocky layered one barrier behind the other, combining their durability, and yet Tucker punched right through them, shattering them both. Rocky was knocked back several feet when the force of Tucker's punch fed back through his barriers, striking him in the chest, but he managed to keep his footing. He looked at Tucker with newfound respect. "I'm impressed," he said. "With all the soul you have in your hands, my barriers should have stopped them cold no matter how hard you punched. I guess I need to work on their durability." Tucker flexed his fingers. It felt like some of them had been broken in his reckless assault, despite the protection afforded by his aura, but he didn't care. He could heal such minor damage easily between rounds. "I'm glad I could help," Tucker remarked, and he launched himself once again at his opponent, meaning to end the fight immediately. Rocky, reading Tucker's intentions flawlessly, willed his energies to mix again, generating more soul and sending it into his aura. Rather than making his aura grow larger or shine brighter, it drew back instead and seemed to be absorbed into his skin. Then his skin began to shimmer with the same rusty color as Rocky's soul, and it took on a texture like stone. Tucker punched Rocky right in the jaw and he was pushed back, but overall he didn't suffer any noticeable damage. Tucker attacked again, throwing a flurry of punches at Rocky's chest and then following them up with a knee to the jaw. Again, Rocky was pushed back, but he wasn't moved as much as Tucker expected, and the only damage that he seemed to suffer was some minor bruising to his face. "This is my stone skin," Rocky explained. "The first inherent power of my earth soul that I ever discovered. It can redistribute the force of any physical blow throughout my entire body at once and greatly reduce how much damage I take. A soul-based attack can still hurt me, so the soul in your fists got through, but the force behind your blows didn't." "You could use pure soul to attack me," Rocky explained, "but I don't think using any big soul blasts would be a good idea inside the building. And besides," he held his hands out at his sides, and another barrier appeared floating just past the fingers of each of them. "That's what these are for. They work better against soul than they do physical attacks." Tucker stepped back to stand at the opposite end of the mat from his opponent, assessing his situation. If Rocky was being honest about his abilities, then something like Tucker's firewall, summoned up from below his opponent, could still defeat him. But Tucker had already decided that was a bad idea. He wasn't so desperate to win that he changed his mind now. He did have an option left, though. He'd already broken through a defense that Rocky had expected to stop him. If he built up enough momentum, he was sure he could do that again. That was how he had broken through Lawrence's defenses, after all, and they'd been on par with this stone skin thing. The problem was, Tucker didn't have the room to build up that much momentum. He had to face the reality that the environment limited his abilities far more than it did his opponents. Many other fighters would have bowed out of the match at this point, but Tucker enjoyed the experience of fighting too much to do something like that. He made the split decision to go for broke, to go as hard as the size of the mat allowed and try to push his opponent out of bounds. He mixed his energies again, and his fiery aura was renewed, burning so bright that the entire room was cast in swirling orange and red. The light spread to his hands, reigniting them with soul-based fire. Tucker willed his aura to split, focusing as much of it as he could into his legs, and the rest of it into his right hand. Until only a couple months ago, this was something that Tucker hadn't even thought was possible, and even after practicing it in the meantime, the effort that it took almost exhausted his remaining stamina. Tucker smiled. Whether this attack worked or not, it would be his last attack of the match. He turned the aura in his legs away from him and charged forward, his aura propelling him at blinding speed. He was on top of Rocky within the very same second. Even though Rocky saw the attack coming, he wasn't able to react in time. Tucker drove his right fist into Rocky's gut. A pulse of energy surged out from the point of impact, and the energy around Tucker's fist and the energy fueling Rocky's stone skin both dispersed. The stony armor shattered and crumbled away. Tucker, despite his exhaustion, pressed forward, driving his shoulder into Rocky's chest, shoving him back, aiming to knock him out of bounds. Rocky stumbled, but he managed to square up his footing again, extending his right leg behind him, digging in with his heel, stopping himself right at the edge. Without missing a beat, he lashed out with both hands, grabbing Tucker's outstretched arm, and he turned in place, levering Tucker over his shoulder and tossing him out of bounds instead. Tucker rolled to a stop, sprawled out in a heap, and Rocky dropped heavily to one knee, almost as drained as his opponent. Standing at the sidelines, Jen wasn't really surprised. Fighting all out, Tucker probably would have been able to conjure up a win. If he'd thought a little more strategically in this particular short little fight, he might have been able to score a draw at the very least. But he'd chosen instead to fight just as passionately as he always did. The consequences be damned, and he enjoyed it as much as he ever had. Jen smiled approvingly down at him, stepped right over him, and moved to observe the other fights still happening in the other quadrants of the room. The fight in the furthest corner, between two of Jack's less impressive students, was already over, but the other two were still going on. One was the heart-to-heart between Monty and Lawrence, where Lawrence's left arm was wrapped in a translucent shell in the shape of a long, lithe reptilian arm with 3 long claws extending from vice-like fingers. He jabbed and swiped at his old friend, using the reach of that avatar arm to his advantage, keeping himself at a distance. Meanwhile, Monty danced nimbly around each of Lawrence's strikes. He gestured, and a soul construct in the shape of a European broadsword sprung from beneath his sleeve. He parried the latest of Lawrence's attacks, knocking his arm wide and then pointing the tip of his sword at his opponent's chest. The blade disappeared in a flash, a stage magician's wand springing from beneath Monty's sleeve to take his place, and Monty fired a magic missile made of soul from the wand's tip, knocking Lawrence back and out of bounds. Lawrence scowled, his avatar disappearing while Monty flourished with his wand magnanimously and bowed low. Jen laughed despite herself and moved on to the only match still going on, the heart-to-heart between another of Jack's students and Jen's sister, Chris. The student was a muscular girl standing a whole 2.5 heads taller than Chris. Coming off of what appeared to be a long exchange, she threw a full power punch at Chris from above. There was so much force behind it that Jen could feel it stir the air even from where she stood. Chris ducked beneath the strike, but she wasn't able to avoid the follow-up, a knee strike to her stomach. She was sent sailing upward, her opponent leaping into the air to follow her, driving her knee into Chris's back, sending her launching like a small comet back toward the ground. She hit hard and didn't stir. Jack jogged over to stand next to the mat where the two girls were fighting, and he began the 10 count. The attention of pretty much everyone else in the room was on that fight now, and most of them seemed convinced that Chris had lost. But Jen knew better. Her sister tended to get a slow start in most fights, but she always finished big thanks to the unique nature of her soul. Chris was almost completely incapable of generating new soul the way other fighters did by mixing her soul and life energies. Her soul just didn't mix with life energy as well as most did. But she did have her own ways of building up her strength, and it was about time for her to show that off. When the count reached 7, Chris finally moved, pushing herself to her knees. At the count of 9, she stumbled to her feet. Her opponent stepped back into her ready stance, but before she could renew her attack, she was distracted when the lights in the room began to flicker. Chris held her right hand up over her head, and bolts of electricity jumped between her hands and those lights as she drew upon the energy powering them. Similar electricity sparked in the air surrounding her, and when Kris met her opponent's eyes again, her eyes were glowing electric blue. Kris seemed to disappear, surging forward so fast that she appeared to teleport directly behind her opponent. She jumped up and turned in the air, kicking her opponent so hard that she stumbled nearly to the edge of the mat. She caught herself and regained her footing, turning in time to see Kris soaring upward toward her, her foot outstretched. She lashed out and wrapped her strong arms around her smaller opponent, only to recoil when she received a powerful electric shock. Kris shuffled forward and drove her little elbow into her opponent's gut, jumped up and kicked her opponent in the chest, and then held her hands out in front of her. Bolts of plasma leapt from her fingers, spreading out like spider webs and blasting her opponent back one final time. The larger girl was knocked clear out of bounds, tripping and sitting down hard. Jen smiled, delighted by her sister's triumph, but her good mood didn't last long. She'd almost forgotten that she was holding the little silver ring in her hand, so she was certainly surprised when it began to glow again. Not in reaction to anything that Jen had done, but in reaction to her sister's outburst of power. Suddenly panicked, Jen closed her hand around the glowing stone and looked around to see if anyone else had noticed. By some miracle, it didn't seem like they had. Carefully, Jen dropped the ring into her pocket, hiding its glow, putting it out of mind.